Hello, this is your host, Ty Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I'm joined again by Terminal Philosophy to continue our History of Warfare series. Today we are discussing the Macedonian way of war, and this will be the beginning of a four-part series on the heyday of the Macedonian Empire with Philip and Alexander and their techniques, tactics, and campaigns. Now, where we left off previously was the Theban hegemony, where Sparta was defeated through several tactical military innovations led by Epaminondas. So if we look at Philip II, he was actually in his youth hostage of Thebes and lived actually in Epaminondas' house. And so one of the things with Philip is that many people argue a lot of these innovations that were floating around in the brighter Greek world, like Iphicrates' Peltas hoplite hybrids, and Epaminondas' deeper formations and attacks and echelon formation were imbibed by Philip while he was living in Thebes as a hostage. Now, one of the things is, as the king of Macedon, I think it was Perdiccas, prior to Philip, was killed in a battle against the Illyrians. And the Illyrians were a mountain tribe in what is today Serbia. And one of the things that Philip does, his first major reform, is his reform of the infantry. So the Macedonians prior to Philip, if they had been known for any sort of prowess, was prowess with cavalry, though that was still a second to the Thessalians. But what Philip does is he pretty much completely transforms the Macedonian army in general, but starting here with the infantry. It seems that many of the reforms of Philip were in part a result of the economic and material poverty of Macedon. So Donald W. Englis, in his work on Macedonian logistics, argues that Macedonia was a poor country. And one of the reasons why the Phalangites would later discard a lot of the heavier armor of the Greek hoplites was because they were poor. But basically, if you look at Iphicrates' lightly armed half hoplite, half peltas, they have longer spears, which are almost a pike. They're not quite a pike, but they're beginning to become a pike, and you need to have two hands to wield them, hence the smaller pelta shield. And when we look at it, we can also see that the Theban reforms of Epaminondas, we mentioned that there was a possibility that he was also experimenting with pikes. And if we take that as a working assumption that Iphicrates and Epaminondas were experimenting with how to use pikes in mass formations, arguably Philip perfected it. And depending on their various sources, the Macedonian pike was either 12 cubits, which was Theophrastus, which is 5.4 meters, 16 cubits, 7.2 meters, or 14 cubits, 6.3 meters. Now, the longer length is given by Polybius. And even though Polybius is later than Theophrastus, some people argue in Polybius' favor in that he was more familiar with the art of war than Theophrastus was. But regardless, we have a very long, massively long pike, which greatly outranges any melee weapon the Greeks are going to bring to the table. It has an iron butt spike, in part to help balance the pike as it's in the user's hands, and then an iron tip at the end. It can be dismantled into two pieces for the ease of carrying. Peter Connolly states that it was made from cherry tree wood, and the shield would be slung over the arm or the shoulder of the phalangite, and it was a much smaller round shield, if not a pelta, something more along the lines of a pelta. Now, they had greaves and a helmet, and it would seem that, according to Polybius, those in the front ranks would have had more of an iron cuirass or vest. Those in the middle ranks would have like a linen, and then those in the rear ranks might not have had any armor at all. And the way they would have it is, given the length of the sarissa, about the first 5 men could have their spear points in front of the main body of the forces, attacking and thrusting and jabbing. And so there's different accounts of the exact numbers for this or that strength of forces for the Macedonian infantry, but I'll use right now Richard Gabriel's. So they start off with a file of 16 men. So from the front man to the back man, it's 16 deep. And they form a platoon of the Tetarchia, which is 64 men, and then a taxiarchia, or a company of 128 men, then a battalion or syntagma of 256 men, a regiment of 1,200 or 1,024 men was a chiliarchia, and a phalanx division was 4 regiments, 4,900 or 4,096 men. And then you had also associated troops, peltasts, siloi, skirmishers, and horsemen, which made up another approximately 4,000 troops. Now, one of the things that's interesting with the 16 deep is the organization for the 16 deep, according to Peter Connolly, is that they had what was called the double pay man, that 10 starter man. So he got less than double pay, but more than the normal soldier. And there were 12 privates. So those would be the guys in the middle. There were 2 up front, 12 in the middle, then 2 in the back. The 4 officers were likely were Macedonian, and the officers would get double pay. And so what we see here is with the phalanx is this more, it's based on mobility and offensive power with its pike. Now, this comes from a much later period, but I think a good description of what it would have been like to go up against a phalanx formation is recorded by Polybius. Polybius writes, many considerations may easily convince us that if only the phalanx has its proper formation and strength, nothing can resist it face to face or withstand its charge. For as a man in close order battle occupies a space of 3 feet, and as the length of the sarissa are 16 cubits, according to the original design, which had been reduced in practice to 14, and of these 14, 4 must be deducted to allow for the weight in front. It follows clearly that each hoplite would have 10 cubits of his sarissa projecting beyond his body, while he lowers it with both hands as he advances against the enemy. Hence, too, though the men of the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th rank will have their sarissa projecting further beyond the front rank than the men of the 5th, yet even these last will have 2 cubits of their sarissa beyond the front rank. With this point in our minds, it will not be difficult to imagine what the appearance and strength of the whole phalanx is likely to be when, with lowered sarissa, it advances to the charge 16 deep. Of the 16 ranks, all above the 5th are able to reach with their sarissa far enough to take actual part in the fighting. They therefore do not lower them, but hold them with their points inclined upwards over their shoulders of the ranks in front of them, to shield the heads of the whole phalanx. For the sarissa are so closely serried that they repel missiles which have carried over the front ranks, and might fall upon the heads of those in the rear. These rear ranks, however, during an advance, press forward those in front by the weight of their bodies, and thus make the charge very forcible, and at the same time render it impossible for the front ranks to face about. So yeah, you can imagine just getting steamrolled by this. Now, of course, they're going to need more training, more rigorous training, and Philip turns the Macedonian peasant into a professional soldier. He calls his pikemen the Persetiroi, or foot companions, which means companions to the king, which is a sort of PR campaign to get people to want to join and serve in the army, because now it's not just the elites who can afford horses, but even, the average peasant who can be, one of the king's men. And the other major innovation for infantry was the hypaspis. And the hypaspis were divided into 3 chiliarchies of 1,000, with one of the 3 being the king's bodyguard, the agema. And they were armed more like a traditional hoplite, which allowed for more flexible maneuver, especially when it came to besieging cities. I mean, obviously a 20-foot pike is going to be no good in a siege. So these are sort of like both the elite bodyguard of the king and also elements of increased mobility. So we see with regards to infantry, Philip completely transforms the Macedonian army, as well as the expectations of warfare in the ancient Greek world. And of course, he speedily crushes the Illyrians under his Sarisse. So that's his infantry reforms. What are some of your thoughts, Turn of Philosophy?
Right. Well, it should go without saying that the reforms under Philip are basically some of the most integral military innovations that antiquity had witnessed up to this point. Um, you and I often talk in private about some of history's most incredible quantum leaps in military tactics, strategies, or the introduction of new equipment. And this is certainly one of those quantum leaps where old tactics were reassessed, equipment had several upgrades, and strategies were more broadly applied to an entire army to reflect the improvements made to specific units on the field. With our episode on the Neo-Assyrians, we identified essentially the introduction of combined arms tactics on a large scale. We'll hear with the Macedonian reforms, this is an example of combined arms at their furthest evolution in the Mediterranean world. By far, at least in my opinion, and from what the reading would suggest, is that the most important improvement made to the Macedonian army was this introduction of the sarissa, basically, as you were saying, basically a very long spear, which is approximately like 13 to 25 feet in length, depending on the position of the soldier within the depth of this Macedonian phalanx. I think now that there is enough evidence to confidently claim that Philip was obviously inspired by both Epaminondas with his deeper phalanx and Iphicrates' use of longer spears and lighter shields. Initially, there was a lot of debate in the archaeological community as to the true and accurate length of the sarissa. However, due to the what would you say, the variety of lengths found, as well as some other various sources of the time, more or less confirmed that there were varying lengths, so that the sarissa tips would create this sort of angled position to have a multi-layered penetrating effect on enemy infantry formations. And this is discussed within Theophrastus's Historia Plantarum. And it was either Polybius or Theophrastus that reported that, again, in addition to this deeper phalanx that you had discussed, as well as these varying lengths of the sarissa, it was either Polybius or Theophrastus that reported that Philip actually had dedicated training to each unit, as opposed to training, in quotes, in a general sense of how to march and perform basic maneuvers, which is something that had been widespread for a very long time at this point in the Mediterranean world. But he actually had dedicated training to units like cavalry, like the phalanx, like the light infantry, such as the peltas. And while, yes, this was used in Sparta and Athens, it wasn't really applied in such an intensive way that I believe Philip had. Whereas again, most armies, you and I sometimes talk about large armies with poor quality of soldiers. Well, this is kind of the complete antithesis of that, where you have not only specialized soldiers that are given specific weapons and told that they have specific roles. Well, now they're kind of being accompanied with specific training. So this was really the core of the Macedonian innovations, just in the phalanx itself, really perfecting both sort of Spartan and Hellenic uses of the phalanx. And again, one thing to keep in mind is that because Philip was in captivity, and just basically due to this development of Greek history up to this point, he had the benefit of sort of observing and absorbing all of these various military histories and tactics. And so he was really, despite Macedonia's poor economic state, and by the time he took over with the death of his brother, he really had the benefit of being in the right place at the right time, and was, at very least, a good student of history, and was able to make this important innovation to his infantrymen. And later on, we will definitely get to cavalry and siege weapons.
Yeah, exactly. And with his cavalry, Philip, there's essentially four, I guess you could say, ethnic contingents. They were the Companions, Macedonian cavalry, the Thessalians, broader Greek contingents, and the Thracians. So and there were essentially three kinds of formations that these groups would fight in. The Companions would fight in a wedge formation, which was invented by Philip. The wedge could either be solid or hollow. A hollow wedge would take fewer men to use. The Thessalians used the rhomboid formation, which was created by Jason of Pherae in 375 BC, and the Greeks fought in a square. And the Thracians seem to have been more like skirmishers, and so not really for the shock of battle, but the prior three were. Now, the companion cavalry were equipped with, a helmet, a cuirass, greaves, and a short sword, but their primary weapon was, it was also called the sarissa, but it was a shorter spear, maybe around 12 feet long, that they would use for either overhand thrusts or underhand thrusts. Not having stirrups and only very rudimentary saddles, we shouldn't view them as using a couched lance formation. Now, they were organized into ilias controlled by an iliarch, and an ilia was 210 strong, but the King's Guard was 300. And of course, this would comport with the Spartan Hippeis and the Theban Sacred Band. And one of the things that we see is that the way Philip used his cavalry was in order to exploit a breakthrough in the enemy lines that was created either by the phalanx or by skirmishers. And there was a sort of a handle and anvil strategy where the body of the phalanx would be like an anvil, and the hypaspists and the skirmisher forces would try to position themselves to create an opening in the enemy line, and then his cavalry could then charge in and pursue. Now, he also developed a kind of scouting cavalry, the prodomoi, or the forerunners, and these are also likely the Thracians. They have javelins, and they are used for scouting. Two other groups appear later under Alexander the Great. Arrian seems to describe lancers that Alexander used at Arbela, and 1,000 mounted archers, presumably in his campaign against the Scythians. Now, later on in life, Alexander reorganized it, where instead of ilia, we have a new tactical unit called hipparches, which were composed of 8 ilia. And so this is the sort of change that we see with the cavalry, and this just gives them a completely overpowering advantage, this sort of mailed fist, if you will, of heavily armored mounted men that could just ride right into a gap and destroy enemy forces and pursue them off the field. Alexander would use this strategy again and again at Granicus and Issus and Gaugamela to target the enemy commander. Now, that could easily go wrong, as we saw with Cyrus the Younger, who was cut off and killed at Canuxa, but it really added a great amount of striking power to the Macedonian army. And the other lightly armed forces that were added were Cretan Archers, the premier mercenaries from Crete, which were bowmen that were used to, most famously by Alexander, to help cover his crossing of the Jaxartes against the Scythians. And then also javelineers, the Agrganians. And so we do have this sort of like complete package of heavy infantry, heavy cavalry, light cavalry, all, as you said, specifically trained for their task and ready to be called upon when needed for any specific tactical decision that the Macedonians needed. And this really was the key to the Macedonian success. This flexibility, this toolkit, if you will, of specially trained soldiers that could be called on for each tactical situation.
Right, exactly. And, well, yeah, again, the second big category here for Macedonian innovation was cavalry, and specifically, it's it's the use of both light and heavy cavalry together. As you mentioned before, Macedonia already had a long equestrian tradition, even long before Philip. So he also had the benefit of inheriting those traditions into his army. Horse riding was not foreign to Macedonia, so that was a huge advantage for him. Heavy cavalry were used mostly on the right flank of the Macedonian formations, and that was right next to the elite heavy infantry, or the Hypaspists. And it was fairly common for many Greek formations of this time to field many of their best units, whether it was cavalry or infantry, depending on the faction or the city-state, typically on the right flank. But the heavy cavalry, again, were used, it would appear, in tandem a lot with the elite heavy infantry, while the light cavalry, which you had mentioned earlier, we have good reason to believe that they played more of a reconnaissance and scouting role. They were placed on both flanks of the army's formation. And there appears to be some debate as to whether or not the sarissa or the dory was used by the light cavalry. I had a tough time finding conclusive evidence on this, but there was, at least most archaeologists were saying that it was highly unlikely that they were using the longer versions of the sarissa, as that would just be obviously too difficult or too wonky to use while horse riding. So it would appear more people are leaning towards the dory, which was probably still around 8 to 10 feet in length, and was a bit lighter. And as you had mentioned before, I mean, for me, what stands out as more kind of the most innovative tactic was both the various uses of different types of wedge formations, the rhombus formation, and working with the infantry to execute what came to be known as the famous hammer and anvil tactic. Alexander would later perfect this, but again, it was introduced by Philip and his generals to really wear down enemy formations from two different sides. And sometimes the hammer and the anvil tactic, of course, as you stated before, the phalanx formations were used as the anvil, but not only were heavy and light infantry used as the hammer, but sometimes other various infantry formations were used as the hammer as well, in tandem with the Macedonian cavalry. And just kind of broadly stepping back for just a moment, it would appear that, Philip almost kind of adapted somewhat of almost an Athenian type of a strategy, where he leaned well on his allies. As you mentioned before, he had mercenary archers from Crete. He had a lot of infantry and lighter cavalry from Thessaly. So you see almost this not necessarily multinational, but maybe multi-regional Greek force, because Macedonia alone could not have raised an army for the size to, again, gain the victories that Philip had before Alexander had taken over. So not only was he just a great strategist and a tactician, but he also understood, he leaned well on his allies. And again, I think, while that doesn't have specifically to do with cavalry that we're talking about here, at least these cavalry formations were well supported by specialized infantry. So I think that's actually a huge role in the broader successes of early Macedonia.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the again, another key element of these innovations, and one that sort of gave the Macedonians the final breakthrough they needed to defeat the Persians in detail, was innovations in siege technology. So as we saw from earlier periods in Greek history, a Greek field army could regularly be expected to defeat its Persian counterpart, beginning with even the Battle of Marathon. But what it could not do was take cities. And so one of the things that stymied Agesilaus' campaign in Asia Minor was his inability to take cities. Now, the introduction of any sort of sophisticated siege methodology was in Sicily via the Carthaginians. So the Carthaginians had been engaging in a series of wars against the city-state of Syracuse in order to take over the island. And under the reign of the tyrant Dionysius I, generally the consensus is that the first catapult was invented, the gastrophedes or belly bow. It was a tension-powered weapon, and by tension, it was literally the tension of the string as you pull it back. Now, there was a mechanical device that you could use to help string the bow, but it was called the belly bow because you'd have to rest it up against your abdomen as you pulled the string up. Now, a much larger version, which was put on a sort of tripod that could pivot and rotate, was called the oxybellies, which could shoot an arrow about 300 yards. But it's, again, basically a tension-powered catapult. The real quantum leap, though, was the invention of torsion power. And torsion power is basically you have two spindles attached to the device, wound with animal sinew as a kind of like fiber or rope. And as you run these cranks that store the energy in these spindles, it can unleash a gargantuan amount of force to propel an object forward. And so now, using the oxybellies, you can convert it into throwing stones. Now, stone throwing, as opposed to just arrows, which is an anti-personnel weapon, you can now knock down enemy walls. Now, the stone throwers are really first accounted for with Alexander the Great. The invention of torsion power is generally ascribed to Pallades of Thessaly, and it was around 340 BC that some of these inventions took place. In fact, one of the incidents that convinced Philip of the need to start using artillery was a battle against the Fokkians. They apparently ambushed them and from a higher position started throwing shot and shell, if you will, into his formations, which produced a ghastly result. And then Alexander the Great's innovations were, under his rule, were many. There was the engineer Diades of Pella, which invented what we might call the tortoise, or a chelone, which is a large wooden shed on a chassis with wheels, which inside of it you can place a ram. You could place a what he called the troupanon, which was a giant beam with an iron head that you would use like a drill by rotating it back and forth to drill through the mortar and brick in the walls. He also improved siege tower design with a drawbridge, the Epibathra. And at the Siege of Tyre, a gargantuan siege tower was built by Posidonius, topping 150 feet, where they had stone-throwing catapults, arrow-throwing catapults, a drawbridge to then have the troops march into the enemy walls. So the drawbridge would be at wall height, and there would be essentially a wooden tower on the siege tower that would be tower height of enemy towers on the wall. And the stone-throwing catapults were called lithoboiloi, and they could be placed on ships, as Alexander the Great did at the Siege of Tyre, or placed on siege towers. And so typically, the way a siege would occur is the Macedonians would, of course, use sapping and ladders, the classic technique. But they would also, if it was a particularly difficult city like Halicarnassus or Tyre, they would bring siege towers, they would bring rams, they would bring the troupanon. And basically, the idea was to have missile fire directed at the walls so the enemy would keep their head down, with the lithoboiloi try to punch hole in the walls, and with siege towers advance, hopefully not being shot at by the enemy because you've kept their head down with missile fire, and then take it by storm. And The other thing we see with the siege of Troy is, or not Troy, Tyre, is Alexander creates a causeway called a mole by taking earth and moving it further out into the sea so that the siege towers and rams can eventually attack the walls of Tyre. So Alexander really just had a galaxy of innovations when it came to siege warfare. And it was really these innovations in siege warfare that turned an already winning army into a world-conquering army, where the great cities of Persia could finally be taken.
Right. Well, as for siege equipment and weapons, one of the interesting things about Greek warfare before the rise of Macedonia was this frustrating reality that no one Greek city-state could effectively and repeatedly take cities. There was no real effective doctrine up until this point. I mean, even Sparta, with all of its military prowess on the open field, were sort of stopped in their tracks with the presence of walls, as this canceled out the phalanx of its primary role. There was just no one had really figured out a way to take cities up until this point. Here with Macedonia's siege equipment and weapons, we see yet again another system of combined arms where beforehand, now under Philip, he didn't invent this, but there was the oxybellus, which was the non-torsion version of the bolter. But under now, I believe it was Polyades, that's right, who was the engineer from Thessaly, who was the one who helped invent the torsion catapult, or the catapultae Macedonicoi, I believe. Yep, if I'm not butchering that too badly. But like as you said, this allowed projectiles to be shot at a much greater range at approximately 300 meters. And with the sort of siege equipment and engineering side of the army, as you mentioned before, there was very specific roles where projectiles were shot at the tops of the walls to keep the defender's head down, while that gave the army an opportunity to push siege towers forward. Now, these bolters were not only fielded in small batteries on the field, but they are also mounted in the siege towers themselves. Which again you can imagine would have been quite the intense, would have been an intense psychological effect on city defenders. So I think the evidence is quite clear that the use of torsion siege weapons was first used by Philip and Polyades. I think without him, without this dedicated engineering corps, I don't think that Philip would have had nearly the reputation that he did gain. So yeah, yet again, you've got such a just a multifaceted system going on here. You've got the use of light and heavy infantry, light and heavy cavalry. You've got the use of mercenary infantry from Thessaly and Crete with their archers, and then you have an actual dedicated engineering or kind of a siege aspect to the army as well. So and again, I think one aspect of Philip's army that does get overlooked is the emphasis on training. Now, you can find plenty of other historians and contemporaneous sources talking about quote unquote training. But again, I think this more has to do with just the bare bones minimum training, meaning like, how to march in a formation, how to execute certain maneuvers, how to handle a spear, how to use a spear, maybe how to use one or two weapons. And, some of the aristocracies, if you will, of some of these earlier societies would become cavalrymen. But here Philip starts to sort of standardize training for specific units, and not only training for a specific unit, but how they work as part of this sort of larger orchestra as one cohesive army. So but yeah, the siege equipment was huge, and I think this is really probably the biggest quantum leap for warfare in antiquity up to this point.
Yeah, exactly. Another crucial element of the Macedonian success, which again often gets overlooked in most histories of warfare, is logistics. The old dictum: the army marches on its stomach.
Absolutely.
And what some of the things that Philip did to improve the logistical properties of the Greek army is, if you look at prior Greek armies, they were used. You'd have a lot of hangers-on. You'd have servants and slaves and women and prostitutes, and you'd also have wagons drawn by oxes. And of course, because this was before the age of the horse collar, the actual harness would choke the animal as it pulled the wagon. So the harder it pulled, the more it would choke itself. So that wasn't really a very good solution to that problem. And it was very slow. And the more all these hangers-on meant you had to feed more people. And so Philip decided against that. He wanted a lightning-fast force, even on foot, and because obviously the ancient Greeks would be slowed down by their baggage trains. So he got rid of the baggage train. He got rid of beasts of burden. He got rid of all female hangers-on, and he only kept one man for every 10 of his own soldiers as someone who would carry supplies. And the supplies that they carried were primarily hand mills for grinding flour and bread and rope, whereas the Macedonian soldier, not only in addition to his own armor, was required to carry about 30 days rations. So basically he created a very lean and streamlined force so they could make these lightning operations that other Greek forces would not even be prepared for. So for example, when Alexander the Great is fighting in Illyricum and Thebes revolts, he marches to Thebes in 13 days. In a fortnight, and they have no idea he could do that. It would have taken much longer to get there. And it's this element of speed and surprise, and getting there when the enemy doesn't expect you to, and being able to use time to your advantage, so that the other forces would be too slow or sluggish to react to you. That's a huge innovation that Philip produced. Now, it worked well in the Balkans, but as Alexander went into Asia, certain changes had to be made. One thing was Alexander realized he did need to have baggage animals, but he didn't go back to oxes. He had camels, horses, and mules. Camels were ideal because in the terrain and the deserts of Asia and the mountains of Bactria, camels are both strong and resilient and need much less water than horses and mules. But a combination of all three were used. Eventually, Alexander did flip-flop on the use of wagons, and as he moved further east after the Battle of Arbela, he seems to have gotten rid of the wagons again. But because his men could no longer return to the Balkans, this was not a seasonal campaign of Philip. This was, to the ends of the earth. Not taking any female attendants might not have been a big problem if you were just going to be away for a campaign or two and then come back, for the wintering season. So Alexander allowed his men to have female companions as well. And so this inevitably slowed the rate of march of the Macedonian army and didn't make it as effective as a strike force as it was under Philip. But also at this time, most of Alexander's large enemy formations have already been defeated. The Persians are already defeated. And frankly, if Alexander did want to perform a lightning operation, like say he did against the Bactrians and the Scythians, he wouldn't even use his main body of forces. He would use his cavalry and light infantry like Peltasts, Cretan Archers, and Hypaspes to create like the strike team. So the loss of flexible mobility could, in a pinch, be compensated for by creating these strike wings of cavalry and more lightly armed infantry. And so we see that these logistical reforms helped create in Philip's army an army that was much faster than its counterpart, both the Greek and the Persian forces, and could effectively outmaneuver them on a predictable basis.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, about logistics. I completely agree. In addition to that, with, the logistical systems having a serious revamping, this allowed campaigning to go underway almost like instantly. Again, this was way faster than any other city-state in the Greek world. And he also, along with that, he elevated the status of a lot of like farmers and so on and so forth to be, in this elevated status of being a soldier. So he kind of, I think you could say that he had some societal reforms that made Macedonians more kind of on the same playing field in terms of that their status as a Macedonian, as opposed to, again, what we've talked about previously with the rigidities of other city states like Sparta. They were dynamic that way, and these logistics, again, with the early defeats of the Dardanians in 358 to the northwest, in part, the reason why they were so badly decimated by Philip, I think, is because of the speed itself to field an army so quickly. And one thing also to keep in mind is that Philip had the early benefit of springing these campaigns out of Macedonia because of favorable terrain, in my opinion, because to the south you have Mount Olympus and Mount Bermion, and then to the northwest you have Mount Barnus, and then you have other various mountains that are in the direction, like this would be northeast towards Thrace. So in a way, Macedonia, before they expanded south to the peninsula, I can't pronounce it, but I think it's called the Chalkidike or something like that. Sorry if I butchered that one, but it's the peninsula with sort of the three smaller peninsulas sticking out to the Aegean. He had a good, basically a geographical base of operations to spring these campaigns from. So, with sort of a contained logistical agriculture system with enough cities to produce food for their armies, he, again, this is opposed to geography like that of the Scythians, where it's just open plateaus. Well, the Macedonians had the benefit of basically being contained to these various valleys, and again, with their speed and all these various dynamic aspects to their army, I think there's no question as to why that they did so well against their neighboring enemies, especially the Dardanians. I don't think that first battle that they had with the Dardanians, I mean, they basically lost about something like 3,000 to 4,000 men, and the Macedonians only suffered, I think, several hundred, 200 or 300 at the most.
The one element, there's two elements for the Macedonians that didn't really develop much at all. Their campcraft was rather primitive. They didn't really do proper scouting, even you think they would have remembered to do that, especially since they had their prodomes. But a lot of ancient armies just didn't take the time to scout. I mean, at Cynocephali, the Macedonians and the Romans walk into each other and don't even know the other side is there. It is interesting. But the fact that he didn't fortify his camp probably wasn't as a big of a problem as it would be, say, if the Romans didn't do it, because his forces were so fast that oftentimes the enemy didn't even know he was there until he was there. And in which case, if they did plan an attack, he might be gone again. So in that regard, it wasn't as big of a deal. The other thing was naval warfare. The Macedonians didn't really develop any naval technique or tactics at all. And really, only the extreme incompetence of the Persians prevented them from using their naval supremacy to decisive effect. The fact that the naval arm is never used is just, it's really baffling that the Persians never used it. They used it a lot in the Corinthian War, the Persian War, but they didn't use it here. Some few minor innovations that Alexander introduced at the end of his career when he's king of Asia is there's an elite form of bodyguards called the Silver Shields, which some people alternatively debate were recruited from the Hypaspists and were just a new name for the Agema, or were recruited from the phalanx formations, and these were just the best men that Alexander will put around him. Regardless of how we assume they were recruited, they seem to have been armed more like the Hypaspes and will continue to be elite bodyguards during the successor wars of the Didachi. Alexander also attempted to train Persian forces to fight in the Macedonian fashion, and even try to hybrid phalanx with like missile troops and pikemen, both of which were a failure, and both of which contributed to Alexander losing the trust and support of his own Macedonian commanders, who sort of viewed them as uncouth barbarians, and they were the ones deserving of Alexander's favors, not these barbarians they'd been fighting against for a decade. And so that was really not, the intent was political rather than military. Alexander wanted to weld his empire together by giving the Persian elites and nobles the sense that, hey, you still have a stake in the system. Because obviously if he had completely stamped them out, they would have revolted against them and made his occupation and rule of Asia much harder. So that was more of a political decision than a military one, and probably why it wasn't repeated by his successors.
Right. Well, that's funny what you mentioned just barely about Macedonian naval warfare. In preparation for this video, I thought, surely there was some sort of like naval innovation somewhere by Philip, but in looking around for it, it's virtually non-existent. It appears almost strictly to be, land warfare. I think, the best you could speculate is that it was, there was probably some military logistics that were naval for the Macedonians in one capacity or another. But all their strengths were applied to land warfare. And I think, when you look at the state of Greece after all the wars that it had suffered up until this point, so many navies had been sunk and lost. And I think it was really a good time to sort of revitalize and rethink both tactics, strategies, and equipment as well. And so again, it was kind of the right time and the right place for Philip. Even though by the time he had taken over, Macedonia was in a really sorry state. That just before then they had suffered the loss of several thousand men in a particular battle. I just can't remember the name of it. But it's really interesting. And then what you were saying earlier about Alexander sort of conscripting the use of various Persians, I wonder if that was in part inspired from his dad, and because of this use of Cretan Archers and Thessalian Infantry and light cavalry. It could have been used. That could have been probably a source for that idea, but that's just kind of speculation on my part. But I suppose we're kind of getting close to the closing remarks, and I guess I'll just say just briefly, I mean, if you were to summarize up the legacy of the Macedonian Reforms and these early days of Philip, it probably comes down to the innovation, the use of new equipment with the Sarissa, and again the use of both light and heavy cavalry, light and heavy infantry, and this this quantum leap use of new siege equipment, which had never been used anywhere in the Mediterranean world, at least to my knowledge. Yeah, it really just comes down to equipment training and tactics, and then he also he interfaced well. He played sort of this, and often in history there's great military commanders or there's great statesmen. Well, he appeared to be good enough of both of those, where he may not have been absolutely a brilliant statesman, but at least he knew that he had to lean on allies and that there had to be a minimal level of fair treatment to other city-states if they're willing to ally with him. And so he knew how to form coalitions, he knew how to innovate, and he knew that speed was a really lacking dimension for warfare up to that point. And again, as we talked about earlier, I mean, even with the legendary formations of Sparta, just the presence of walls or or bad terrain kind of canceled out the effectiveness of a phalanx. Well, he answered that with really dynamic siegecraft and siege weapons. So yeah, I mean, he is absolutely the reason why Alexander inherited such a dynamic military in the first place. And I think next video we'll go on to the actual campaigns of Philip. But I think it was really important that we first establish here why the Macedonians early on were as successful as they were.
Yeah. I guess I'll just end with the statement that the key to the Macedonian success was the sort of rediscovery of a combined arms system, which we hadn't really seen since the ancient Assyrians. And thanks again, Terminal Philosophy.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.